It is now 5 p.m. Stay tuned for Revolutions Per Minute, hosted and produced by the New York City members of the Democratic Socialists of America, coming up.
Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Tuesday at 5. RPM is about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Every week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in NYC. Join the movement at socialists.nyc.
Hey, what's up, New York City? This is Amy Wilson. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute live from the new WBAI studios. We are a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the United States, with 56,000 members nationwide. New York City DSA is its biggest chapter. We are run by our 5,500 plus members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. I'm an organizer with DSA of North Brooklyn, and I use she, her pronouns. On today's show, we're talking about socialist self-care. Artist and activist Audre Lorde wrote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." As organizers, we know that caring for ourselves and our communities emotionally and spiritually is a critical aspect of pursuing our socialist project. Yet, the concept of self-care is often commodified and removed from its radical tradition in order to advance consumerism and fracture solidarity. On today's episode, we'll discuss self-care and community care from our experience as socialist organizers fighting back against racialized patriarchal capitalism in our work, school, home, and personal lives. We'll also hear an update from Kazembe Balagun of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung on this month's ongoing series of programs in the spirit of Audre Lorde, Black Solidarity in a Global Context. But first, the headlines with Simone Norman.
Last week's rule change that outlawed brokers' fees has been halted for at least a month by a state judge as a result of a lawsuit by the real estate industry. New York State Senate Democrats unveiled a proposal to roll back the bail reforms passed last year. Brad Lander's Reckless Driver Accountability Act passed after an extra round of scrutiny from some lawyers. With the launch of the new Omni system, you can read about Cardvark on thethorn.nyc, the MTA's ill-fated MetroCard mascot. And in election news, Democratic operatives are speculating that Andrew Yang will run for mayor of New York City in 2021. Mayor de Blasio endorsed Bernie Sanders for president. Representative Gregory Meeks, the chair of the Queens County Democratic Party, endorsed Mike Bloomberg for president. And finally, city limits covered the housing platforms of incumbent Representative Yvette Clarke of New York 9 in Brooklyn and one of her primary challengers, Adam Bunkadeko. And you can read more about that on thethorn.nyc as well.
Thank you so much, Simone. Our headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by NYC-DSA's Electoral Working Group, covering local politics and radical activism. As Simone said, you can subscribe at thethorn.nyc. And radio is not a visual medium, which is a shame sometimes. I wish you all could have seen our faces when Simone read the headline about Andrew Yang considering a run for mayor. Wow, that was a curveball. Okay, so as we dig into today's topic here on Revolutions Per Minute, we're going to kick off the show with a conversation with Kazembe Balagun, who's on the phone, I believe. Hi.
Good evening. Hello. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you? You're on live on WBAI.
Wonderful. Hello to the WBAI audience, the best audience in the world.
Oh, nice. Let me tell them who you are, if you don't mind. You're Kazembe Balagun, a writer, cultural organizer, and socialist residing in Co-op City, the Bronx. Kazembe currently serves as a project manager for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office and is a member of the New Day Church in the Bronx. So thank you so much for coming on to speak with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And I understand that the Rosa Luxemburg Center is doing a series this month that you thought our DSA and WBAI audience might be interested in. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is the public policy arm of the Left Party in Germany, which is the largest left electoral group in Germany right now. We have about 15 different offices around the world. In the New York office is celebrating Black History Month alongside the Goethe Institute with a series of programs called Black Solidarity in a Global Context. This series will encompass a number of film screenings. In fact, one is happening tonight at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung at 6:30 with a screening of Audre Lorde in Berlin, the 1984-1992. And it will continue until next week with the screening of Free Angela Davis and All Political Prisoners and a panel discussion on February 29th, also at the Goethe Institute on Black Solidarity in the Global Context. The kind of making of this series is kind of like something that many people don't discuss is the role that Germany has played in the Black imaginary in terms of the Black freedom struggle globally. In the 1940s, in the post-World War II era, there was a slogan by African Americans called the Double V campaign, which was the fight against fascism in Europe and the fight against racism at home. And this really encouraged many Black GIs within the armed forces, as well as mass movements in the United States, to kind of see Black freedom struggles and Black liberation struggles within not just within the confines of the United States, but across the world. And certainly during the 1950s, there were a number of Black GIs who had access to the GI Bill, who actually went to Germany and actually stayed in Germany, had families in Germany, and in many ways was still subject to segregation in some ways in West Germany. And so in many different ways, Black GIs, Black cultural workers, African-American cultural workers, and African-American GIs kind of like saw Germany as an extension of the fight against racism and fascism. And this certainly extended way into the 1950s and 1960s when you have figures such as Angela Davis, who many people know as an African-American feminist philosopher, actually studying in Germany. She actually got a PhD in philosophy at Humboldt University, and engaging with various forms of the New Left. In fact, some of the largest solidarity communities for the Black Panther Party were in Hamburg and Berlin, and a number of Black Panthers spoke in Berlin in the 1960s.
Wow.
And extending all the way into the 1990s, in the 1980s, 1990s, you have the lesbian poet Audre Lorde, who happens to be her birthday today.
Yes.
And she, socialist feminist Audre Lorde, who traveled to Berlin on a lecture on the invitation of Dagmar Schultz at the Free University. And when she gets to Berlin, the story goes that she goes to a poetry reading, sees nothing but white women and there's a few smattering of Black women, and then promptly asked the white women to leave.
Okay.
and then begins to have a long conversation with some of the Black women feminists who were there, May Aram, Ilka Hugo Marshall, and a number of other Black women, Afro-Germans, and that nucleus becomes the nucleus for an anthology called Farbenkannen, Showing Our Colors, which is the first, the birth of what is considered the Afro-German civil rights movement.
Wow.
Which happened around 1987. And so, so this has been kind of cross-fertilization between African Americans and German culture that to push outwardly in terms of this idea of, like, what is freedom, but also during the Cold War and during different periods of time, like kind of bending those walls that existed in Berlin and different places to kind of, like, leverage international power to see how we can fight for freedom domestically and freedom internationally.
Wow. Well, thank you for giving us a little brief introduction to that very fertile and interesting crossover. And again, you can you say when the upcoming events are? There's one tonight, the Audre Lorde screening, and you have a few next week, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the Audre Lorde screening is tonight. In case people want to listening in, they can come to 2275 Madison Avenue between 40th and 40th on Madison between 40th and Park. In the 21st floor. We're doing a screening of Audre Lorde in Berlin. Audre Lorde said any party that she's a part of has to have food, so there'll be some free food here. And the screening is also free.
Nice.
So free to come to do that. And then next week on the 26th, that's Wednesday, at the Goethe Institute, we'll be having a screening with Charlotte Lynch of her film, Free Angela Davis and All Political Prisoners. And Charlotte Lynch, who directed the film, will be in conversation with myself in the post-film after the film. And then on the 29th, that Saturday at 4 p.m. at the Goethe Institute, there will also be a panel discussion at 4 p.m. on the history of Black solidarity in Germany. The Goethe Institute is located on Irving Place between 15th and 16th Street, right across the street from Irving Plaza. So in case people are interested in that. And you can also find out more information to our website. I guess people don't do www anymore. RosaLuxNYC.org is RosaLuxNYC.org.
Yeah, I feel like people just fill in the www sort of automatically these days. So RosaLuxNYC.org is your website.
That's correct, yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I've got two lovely organizers in the studio with me, and we're going to sort of build on this question of the topic of socialist self-care and how it relates to our work as organizers and how we challenge capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy and these other oppressive structures. So I'm excited to get down to that conversation. But since we do have you on the line here, I'm wondering if you could kind of kick us off and answer the question for me, why socialist self-care, and how does the concept of self-care in your mind speak to anti-capitalism?
Wow, you guys are coming with the hard questions.
Always. This is revolutions per minute. You got to get used to it.
Absolutely. So what I would say is that, what I would encourage all young socialists to do is, if you have a chance, if you have a collected works of Marx, read the little essay called Theses on Thornbach. It's a small essay. It's about a page and a half. And really what he talks about is he asks the question, what is materialism, right? And the essence of materialism for Marx is social relationships, right? And he uses the term sensual materialism. So, when we talk about, a lot of times when we talk about economics, we talk about, class struggle, we tend to be a little bit hard-edged in our conversation. But, for Marx, in this instance, he's talking about something a little bit softer. He's talking about sensuality, right? And how we relate to each other, how we touch each other, how we feel each other, how we create social relationships to each other, and how we create culture. So for me, socialist self-care always starts with the other. It always starts with the sense of wanting to, give the other pleasure and acknowledgement and a sense of humanity first and foremost. And then I think internally it's also just for myself. I always think about it as a socialist self-care is how do I want to show up for myself, and then also show up in the world in the ways that I want to show up for myself.
Right.
And for me as an activist, I've been active in the political movement since I was 16 years old. What I noticed is that for a lot of us, we put a dichotomy or separation between protest and self-care. And what I found is that when I was protesting, I was also engaging in self-care. Because when I was protesting conditions that for other people, a discord entered into me in saying hey, I don't particularly like the situation that I'm in. I got to fix it too. And so for a lot of us, it also initiated a coming out experience. And not just coming out with sexuality, coming out of bad relationships, coming out of bad jobs,
right.
coming out of bad, parental situations and things of that nature. So for me, socialist self-care is also is both within and without, is both giving sensuality to the other, but also acknowledging that discord within ourselves is something that kind of leads us in terms of wanting to have more satisfaction, not just for yourself, but for the other too.
Wow, thank you so much. I think that answer speaks a lot to what my guests and I have been speaking about in the preparation for the show, and hopefully we'll be able to expand and give some texture on that over the course of the rest of the hour. So this has been this is Kazembe Balagun from Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. Check them out, rosaluxnyc.org, and check out this series. There's a screening tonight and 2 events next week. And thank you so much for coming on to speak with Revolutions Per Minute.
Thank you so much, Revolutions Per Minute, and I appreciate you all. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. All right. So this is Revolutions Per Minute. We are on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com. You can find us on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, or on Twitter at NYCRPM. Today we're talking about socialist self-care. And to help me do so, I have 2 guests in person here in the WBAI studios. So welcome to each of you. And if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your work within DSA and how you came to organizing. Then we'll dig into our topic for the day.
Great. Thanks for having me, Amy. My name is Cheryl. I use she, her, and I came into organizing fairly recently, a few years ago. I was just looking for something to be involved in. I saw a reading group on Black radical feminism, and I attended it. The reading group was run by the NYC DSA Socialist Feminists. It's a working group. And from there, it just kind of kicked off for me. I met Marion Jones, a very good comrade, very big in SocFem, and she was like, you have a lot to say, so do you want to facilitate some reading groups since you be talking all the time? And I was like, I guess so. So I facilitated some reading groups, and from there, a lot of the work that I'm involved in right now started with the abolition reading group, Prison Abolition. A group wanted to continue on after the reading group and become an action group. Essentially, we wanted to put some stuff into practice. And so we formed kind of a subcommittee in SocFem, Abolition Action, and I spent a lot of time working with that group. We're working on a workshop, so we do some political education. I do political education with SocFem still, too, and community building, a lot of that, and mutual aid.
Welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, I'm Sabrina. I go by they or Sabrina, and I got involved with organizing in general when I came to New York City for urban planning for grad school, particularly within environmental justice work. And then within DSA, I was involved with Julia Salazar's campaign, doing canvassing. That was like my first get out the vote, which was really exciting. I was also involved with AfroSoc. I was the interim OC and went to New Orleans and really got to experience all that Blackness has to offer, which was really amazing. And then also got involved with the political education working group within AfroSoc and helped organize the AfroSoc Journal. And I'm currently working on Jabari Brisport's campaign. He's running for a state senate for District 25 on the DSA endorsed slate. But more importantly, within my professional life, within the work that I do, I work for the city. I've been organizing a racial and social justice working group to really reflect on the ways in which internally as well as our external policies are racist or not, and how we can be better.
So thanks so much to both of you for being here. And I do also want to shout out a comrade who helped put this show together, even though she's not here in the studio tonight. She brought us all together. It's Adriana Warner. So Adriana, if you're listening, thank you so much for helping make this possible. So let's dig into it. What are we talking about when we talk about self-care and community care? Which of you would like to take a stab at sort of a basic definition of each of those terms?
I feel like I'm going to go first because I got to preview when we talked before what Sabrina was going to say, and their response sounded real smart, so I'm going to say mine first. Self-care is holding, to me, I think self-care is holding that space for what you need, what's going to keep you going, and what's going to help you be in community with people. But I do think that there is that need to hold that space for what you as an individual need. So when we talk about self-care, I think about holding that space for yourself and getting help to hold that space for yourself from others.
For me, self-care is this political process of decolonization and the struggle of decolonization of the mind and the imagination, and like the process of confronting whiteness in a way that's constructive and allows for healing. And a lot of this I derived from Bell Hooks. I'm currently reading Killing Rage. And I know for me, self-care is really tied to this thought of rage, because I have a lot of bitterness and rage in me by being, like, I guess, politically conscious. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of self-care to me is this political consciousness education and this nurturing of my decolonized mind and understanding what that means and what it looks like to be Black in a space that doesn't, in a world that is very anti-Black, and kind of nurturing that spirit of resistance that's suppressed daily by white supremacy, and holding space for self-love. So that's how I would define self-care.
Yeah, and there's a lot of sort of resonance between the two of you and the individual definitions that you just gave. So extending out of that, what do we mean when we say community care, and what's the relationship between those two terms as you understand it? You got this, Cheryl.
Yeah. Yeah, you need your self-care to maintain that joy in yourself, that vitality, and you have to really be intentional with that to make that space for yourself. And a community is just individuals together, and a community has the needs just like an individual has needs, our collective needs together. Often, I think a community care is how do we liberate ourselves as a collection of individuals. And I see that connection between like self-care and community care as I can't really give my all. I can't give the things I need to give to my community to help us liberate ourselves if I have nothing in the tank personally. Right. If I'm just worn out, if I haven't held any space for myself, then I don't think I'm coming to my community in the space to uplift myself and them together, to hold my part of the load.
So so we use these terms kind of separately, but also interchangeably in a certain way that, in a way, it also confronts, like we were talking about downstairs, Cheryl, before we even started the show, the relationship between the self and the collective, right? That when we start to really get into these concepts, you sort of see, are these separate, or in what ways are they separate? And is that the way that we commonly understand it? Or is there a way to sort of change the understanding of the relationship between self and community by way of these sort of philosophical theories about caring for each, right?
And related to that, like capitalism and white supremacy in general destroys community and uplifts the individual, like this liberal individualism, and removes that accountability. So for me, community care is about taking ownership of the community, and that having that community accountability, and in a way, as well as challenging hierarchy and building capacity collectively, and kind of having a shared understanding collectively of goals and values. And I think those are things that just capitalism inherently destroys.
Right. So we'll dig into that in just a minute, sort of the anti-capitalist aspects of these two concepts. But before we get there, you've mentioned bell hooks, Sabrina. We've talked about Audre Lorde. Kazembe brought up Audre Lorde. Are there any other sort of seminal? Well, that's not the right word. There's got to be, oh my gosh, are there any other matriarchal texts or thinkers or lineage that reflect these concepts that we're working with today?
Yeah, what was interesting is I was trying to do some reading. I feel like a lot of the black feminists, radical black feminists we read in the very first reading group I came to, DSA for, have a lot to say, even if not directly straight on, but in a sort of, what's the word I mean? They're coming at it from the side, about self-care. So I saw some stuff in Angela Davis, which relating to community care and self-care. That syllabus, I think I'm also going to link that in a tweet at the end of this show, so anyone can access that syllabus and read it for themselves as a great resource. But something, a thinker actually that I've been thinking about in the past few weeks is someone contemporary. Jenny Odell wrote a book, How to Do Nothing. This book was on President Obama's reading list for 2019, supposedly. I mean, I find it hard to believe. It's all about rejecting the terms of the capitalist society. And this wasn't framed as an act of self-care necessarily, straight on. But I do see it as an arsenal and the tool of self-care, this radical act of not producing just any real benefit to the capitalist society, of taking a pause, of doing nothing, of holding space essentially for yourself to be outside of the normal, that is to say the capitalistic society we've built, and to potentially then, by holding that space for yourself, find other options, what Jenny Odell calls the third way, to move forward. So rejecting essentially the terms that you're given by holding space for yourself to do nothing. And I find that to be a really radical act of self-care. And a tool that I have used potentially like unconsciously and now trying to use with more intentionality before, when I kind of remove myself for a moment, because I need to figure out, like, where do I actually stand? Is this actually something I want to be involved in, instead of just allowing myself to be ferried along in the society that is presented to me and that most of the time I don't agree with.
Another book I'm reading is How We Fight White Supremacy. I forget the author's names, but it's basically a collection of different folks, different black folks, and the ways in which they're self-caring in a way, by, writing poems, or they're, making art, they're, showing themselves, they're, allowing themselves to heal, to grieve, to reflect. And I really enjoy like going through this collection because it's a reminder of the struggle, but also like the joys of blackness, and how fighting white supremacy in itself is an act of self-love and self-care.
Anybody else that you think is really essential that we get out in this conversation?
The names are not appearing to me. Everyone read the last week the Radical Black Feminist syllabus. I could try to pull it up right now and see what we have here.
Yeah, and we're gonna, as Cheryl said at the end of the show, the Socialist Feminist account is going to make that syllabus that Cheryl's been referring to over the course of the show public. So for those of you who are out there listening and you want to engage more with these concepts and these thinkers that we've been talking about for the first half of the show, that'll be possible to do through the magic of social media, right?
Yes.
Awesome.
I'll also add Toni Morrison. And it's her birthday, too.
It's her birthday.
But she writes a lot on like Black beauty and otherness, and that's also related to self-care.
Toni Morrison as well. I'm glad that you brought her up because it is her birthday, and also because one thing I learned about her when she passed away, actually, what was that, last year or the year before? Yeah. It was relatively recently. There was, when people pass, there are always these moments that resurface of them, and you kind of see the highlights of their life. And I saw a really beautiful speech that she gave to the National Writers Union, where she was encouraging writers to think of themselves as workers and to unionize and to see themselves in that way long before this current moment where we see that happening. So I think that's something that you don't always hear in connection with Toni Morrison. So I'd like to bring it up when I can. So speaking of anti-capitalism and worker power, I'd like to dig a little bit into, what makes self-care socialist, or how do those two terms relate to each other? I have a different positionality than the two of you do related to this concept because I'm white. I'm a white woman, and the way that self-care is sold to me is just that. It's a sell, right? It's a very consumerist mindset, and been meditating a lot on how a lot of the way that you see self-care commodified relates to, it's okay to take a break. It's okay to unplug, the bath bomb, or the infamous example of the Tina Fey sheet cake, right? So rather than participating in political action, treat yourself to a manicure or some type of sweet treat, which for me is just a clear way of kind of protecting white women fragility. Right. And saying you have the privilege to choose whether you're going to engage or disengage. So why don't you go ahead and disengage? Don't worry your pretty little head about it. Right. And I reject that. I reject that really strongly. But that's coming from my positionality. So I'd love to hear what the two of you, from your experience as organizers and your sort of theoretical mindset, why are we here on Revolutions Per Minute, the show of the Democratic Socialists of America, talking about self-care?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Also, as it is in a visual medium, Sabrina and I are both black. Just context. I know Amy was as I am white, but, so everyone in the room knows. You at home. I definitely see the self-care, it's a real big movement right now, but it's very framed in that capitalistic way of you deserve a treat. It's also very feminized, which is interesting because you're both being encouraged to think of yourself as an individual, to do self-care as a means of essentially putting up walls, you go into your bath and you're all alone, and that's the point, to be alone, and there's nothing else there, so self-care is building these walls to keep the terrible outside icky world out, with almost no sort of regard to our responsibility that we have in this world and to each other. Yes, the world is pretty terrible, but we have a responsibility to be in it. And I feel this current moment of self-care is very anti that. It's very much encouraging you to take a break, to step out of it. And if anything, when you step back into the world, only to step back in, revitalized to be a better worker, produce more value. Right. And also I say feminized because I think what's interesting, the way you're framing it, don't worry your pretty little head about it, is that both the self-care is being pushed really big right now in this individualized way and this consumerist way. Buy this product, that'll make you feel better, but also you're dumb for doing it. There's an underlying sense of, because this is a feminized kind of concept, because you're kind of silly. So now you say self-care, and there will be people that I talk to who are very dismissive of the concept, not just because it's a consumerist kind of oriented concept in the mainstream, but I think also because it's essentially quote unquote a girly. It's a silly thing. Look at you in your bath bomb, when really I don't think that's that's where self-care, that's not where it came out of, and I don't think that's not the socialist conception of self-care.
Yeah, like, for me, I think self-care is very much rooted in, like, the radical act of just being Black, and so I think, like, doing the crystals and yoga, meditating, for me is thank you, is like life or death. You know, like, if I don't do these things to center myself, like, whiteness is killing me slowly. So it's like, I don't just engage in self-care. Yes, it's being, like, marketed to me, but I engage in it because for like my mental health sake, because we know that just the world is just so anti-Black and white supremacy is so, like, much like it's just like can damage your mind. So just the radical act of doing things to preserve Blackness is very much how I see self-care.
Right. I think you both make excellent points, and I don't think it's a mistake that in the sort of original written conception of this concept, which most people attribute to Audre Lorde, she does say it's self-preservation, and that's an act of political warfare, right? So there's that, the intensity that's there in the conception of the concept that's like, this is not an option, this is a necessity. And I think that's when we're sold it as an option in a marketplace of options, that's a way of commodifying this tradition itself, as well as the actual products that are being sold under the name of self-care. And I do also want to underscore what Cheryl said about the feminized nature of it, which by its nature excludes people who are occupying masculine identities and also excludes people who are occupying neither masculine nor feminine identities, right? So by conflating it with femininity, it's being devalued by virtue of the way that patriarchy functions, and it's also kind of implicitly saying to everybody who's not a woman, like, this is not for you. You don't have to take care of yourself. You don't have to take care of your community. And how does that ripple out, right? What are the effects of that? So the show is flying by. This conversation, yeah, this conversation is so interesting, and we are going to open the phones as we usually do right around 5:45. But before we get back into our topic of socialist self-care, there is something that I need to say to you. So you're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI. We're broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. And where else on the radio can you hear in-depth conversations like this on philosophy, theory, and radical politics? Right? We need community-controlled WBAI on the airwaves now more than ever. As Reggie said when he introduced us this evening, here at WBAI, we don't answer to corporations or foundations. We answer to our listeners, that's you, and our producers. So as Audre Lorde herself wrote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And in order to challenge the oppressive structures we're currently living under, we need to build counter-institutions formed from the ground up by the voice of the people. So if you've already given to WBAI, you can consider yourself part of that effort, and thank you. If you haven't yet given, please consider doing so now. I'm going to read out the number, 516-620-3602. Once again, that's 516-620-3602, or give to WBAI.org. That's the number 2. So give to WBAI.org and tell them that Revolutions Per Minute sent you there. So before we open the phones and see if there's anybody out there who'd like to join the conversation, I'd love to sort of take this and bring it down to the level, not down.
up to the level.
You always have to watch yourself for hierarchical language and things like that. You do. Everybody in the studio is laughing at me right now.
Laughing in a agree way.
Thank you. So how do we take this out into the world? How do these concepts of self-care and community care inform our socialist organizing? If you have an example from your organizing life, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, for me, this is as a really big concept for me right now. As this abolition action group is very young, it's about a year old, and this group came out of this desire for us to figure out how we would really be abolitionists in practice, not just in theory. And one thing we did was our first thing we did was hold a study group for the Creative Interventions Toolkit that's available online for free. I encourage you guys to use that. It's a toolkit for how to hold creative interventions for violence and conflict without involving the police, the carceral state. And a big thing in there was that you need a community to do a creative intervention. You can't do a creative intervention with people you don't know. This is about responding to violence in your community. And we came up on this wall of like, how does a community form? And that's that element of community care. And so we went about trying to make a big part of our work together was forming this community. But as anyone who is involved in any sort of organizing knows, you start to feeling that feeling of burnout. Like the potential of burnout starts to loom. We were all doing a lot to try to get this group off the ground. We were meeting twice a month. There's agendas. There's, events. We're putting on a monthly newsletter, building political education. And we had to be very intentional about holding space for our own self-care, being able to take a step back from the group and say, look, I need this moment to care for my mental health, for myself, to hold some space for myself. And I need your support in doing that. So we were very intentional about structuring who does what little task. All these little tasks add up, but who does what so that everyone is not doing too much, so that we all have that space to care for ourselves. And in that way, when we come back to this group, what we have is all of ourselves to offer versus just that tiny bit of self that slowly is burning out.
Right. I love that. I really responded to that as an example of self and community care. Those who know me as an organizer might know that I'm very interested in administration, and I study labor studies, and I'm interested in the way that administration gets feminized and all this stuff. And to understand it through that lens of like, this is taking care of our community when we figure out, who's doing the chores, right? Who's sweeping the floor, who's making the agenda, who's putting the chairs away, and being intentional about that. To me, that was a really transformative thing. So I do want to thank you for bringing that to me.
Yeah, I would also add, so we had AfroSoc had a call about reparations, and this notion of healing as truth came up, and I kind of relate that to community care, because I think of community care as truth through healing, and building that trust, and holding that space with the community about truth and about. So, for example, we were trying to understand, reparations can come in many different forms. People usually talk about it in economic ways, but as Bill Fletcher was on the call and was leading the call, and as he was trying to explain, as socialists, as a community, I think it's really important that we really step back and really recognize our history first before we kind of dive in, and having that kind of shared understanding in itself caring, because we're all on that kind of like same level playing field, so that we can all then do the work together, so that we're not kind of learning at different stages. That kind of really hit home for me.
Wonderful. So, It's the time of the show when we do open the phones for those who may be interested, feel that they have something to contribute to this conversation about socialist self-care and community care that we're having here on Revolutions Per Minute. I know that WBAI reaches a community of activists and organizers, so I'm suspecting that there are people out there who have wrestled with these very concepts, maybe come to the edge of burnout and came back from that, or dealt with sort of these communal situations that we're discussing on the show. So the question today is, what's one thing that you do as an activist, an organizer, a political person? What's one thing that you do to take care of yourself? How have you developed your practice of self and community care? If you'd like to call us, the number is 212-209-2877. Once again, that's 212-209-2877. And while we wait for the phones to light up with people calling with productive comments and suggestions, let's talk a little bit about these concepts of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma that came up in our preparation for the show.
It was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah. Would you be able to give us a little intro of that?
Yeah. So compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are both things that can occur for people who do kind of trauma work and social workers or psychiatrists, psychologists, but also the work that we do as organizers, kind of being on the front lines of seeing people living in the conditions that under capitalism that we're living in, and so compassion fatigue is like essentially it's like burnout, but you're seeing too many of these kind of horrible stories, and that you say I can't take it anymore. You're like literally compassioned out, and then vicarious trauma is you're kind of experiencing that the lived experience and the story of that person, and kind of experiencing that PTSD through them.
So this is for people who the concepts originate with people who do the work professionally, right? But there's been some expansion of it to people who might do it in an organizing or more volunteer capacity.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. So it's like important to recognize that compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are things that can happen similarly like burnout in this type of care where we're doing mutual aid. And I think I'm still kind of coming to terms with exactly what that means, but it relates to community care in the sense that if we all kind of recognize these terms, burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, then we can kind of create like care, like self-care documents, I guess, and share that with our community. And so then when we're feeling like, look, I'm going through this right now, I need to step back, then we can have like shifts in the way that we're doing our work. We can kind of reorganize our organizing to ensure that the community is really being taken care of with these things in mind.
Right. Developing this shared language is a huge part of developing our ability to reckon with these concepts. So I've got people on the phone. Is that right? Hi, you're on with Revolutions Per Minute.
Hello. How you guys doing?
We're doing well. Thank you so much for calling in. Have you been listening to our show about socialist self-care?
A little bit. I just got home, actually. But I did, I heard enough of it. You guys just want to know kind of what people do to kind of unload or, just kind of wind down or whatever, right? If
right,
you're involved
exactly. If you're involved in politics or activism, as so many of our WBAI community are.
Yeah. Hi. So, my name is Kat. I'm from Brooklyn, and I am a Bernie supporter, very active. I do whatever I can. I make phone calls a lot, and I, excuse me. So, what I try to do, make my phone calls, but when I feel like it's just too much, because I'm also a massage therapist, so you give like that kind of, that can take a toll on you as well.
Absolutely.
So what I try to do is just get my nature in as much as I can.
Mm-hmm.
My apartment faces east, so I try to catch the sunrise. I cook. I just really kind of, try to have some silent time. I noticed that if I stay unplugged at least if I can, the first half hour of the day, just no phone, nothing, I feel better. Just give myself some time to just have some silence, just do some breathing. Because just even like this morning, I woke up and I wanted to listen to Democracy Now! So that was the first thing, put that on and everything. And I noticed that if I start my day that way, without having any silence and kind of intention setting for the day, I'm off. I feel a little bit kind of triggered throughout the day. It's just like, I need just to have a little bit of time where it's just nice and quiet, and then I can kind of get the news and stuff like that. If I just turn the radio on right away and it's stuff, whatever.
Right.
It's always happening, right?
Yeah, those are great suggestions. Thank you so much. I heard nature, I heard natural light, I heard setting boundaries with the information that you're taking in. Those are wonderful suggestions. Thank you so much for calling, Kat. We've got another caller on the line. Hi, you're on with Revolutions Per Minute. How are you doing today?
Mahalo. I'm calling from Honolulu, Hawaii.
Oh, my goodness. Wow. Thanks so much for calling in. And
yes, what I do is basically, because I was involved in Mauna Kea over in Oahu, protesting, and I've been an activist against Pearl Harbor, getting the U.S. Navy's get the U.S. Navy out of Pearl Harbor, and also fight for eventually ending colonialism in Hawaii. So what I do a lot of meditation. I do a lot of cooking. We're walking. I go into the country and waterfalls and so on. So that's what I basically do, and do because I notice, among my fellow brethren, a lot of very high, overweight among the Mahiki Maoli, a lot of very overweight, high blood pressure. With me, I do a lot of working out, push-ups, sit-ups. I go to University of Hawaii. I do, jogging down the track field and so on.
Yeah, you make an excellent point that people whose bodies aren't valued under our current hierarchical system do suffer the physical effects of that, and that these are very, when we talk about like the pain of racism or the pain of patriarchy and the pain of capitalism, many people experience that directly in their bodies. That's so true.
Great. Well, Oahu.
Thank you so much for calling in. It's wonderful to hear from you. So we do have to start wrapping up our show, and we do have some suggestions for how people can take these topics that we've been discussing over the course of the hour and sort of bring that out into their lives as organizers and activists. So would you like to share?
Sure. So Abolition Action has a great community event. We do, as I said, we try to build our community very deliberately and care for each other there. We usually do a round of who needs what do I need, what do I have to give at our People's Potluck. So this is our monthly community building mutual aid event. It's open to whoever would like to attend, but you do have to RSVP to get the exact location. Our March People's Potluck is going to be on March 13th. That's a Friday, and it's going to be at my apartment, actually. So if you thought this voice sounded very interesting, you could come and look at what I potentially look like and make some community. I'd be very happy to see you.
Wonderful. So that's the Abolition Action, the potluck, the community potluck that you have next month. We also had some. We also thought maybe. Would you like to share it with the
Medicare for All?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's the notion like self-care and white supremacy, capitalism is all tied to like mental health essentially, and how it's like affecting our mental health. So it's just really important to continue to organize for Medicare for All, because it'll cover mental health, and it's just super important that we have access to quality mental health, period.
Right. It's not going to get rid of these issues that we've been talking about over the course of the show, but it's going to make it so much easier to deal with when people have access to the medications that they need, the therapy that they need, without worrying about the finances of it. So get on out. Take care of yourself, and then also get on out there. And we also had we talked about some suggestions of finding your people, looking for people who you can build a circle with, being intentional, supporting your comrades, and then of course do the work and do the reading. And please check out Cheryl. You want to shout out the Socialist?
Yes. Leave me shouting out the Socialism and actually struggling. So. Socialism has a Twitter account where I'm going to tweet out the syllabus for the radical black feminism. The last week on that syllabus is all about self-care. It's at NYC Socialism, NYC SOCFEM. So NYC Socialism, and that's our Socialist Feminist Twitter account. And I'll tweet out not only the link to that syllabus, but also a link to the March potluck, if anyone out there is interested in attending.
Wonderful. And we'll definitely amplify those from our Revolutions Per Minute account. So follow us at NYCRPM, and make sure that you come back next week, Tuesday at 5 here on WBAI. Thank you so much, Cheryl and Sabrina, for being here and engaging in this conversation. It's been wonderful to have you. I'm Amy Wilson. Oh, you're so welcome. I'm Amy Wilson. That's me. And this has been Revolutions Per Minute. We're the show of the Democratic Socialists of America. And we want you to join our movement and help us build a better world.